Well, I want to welcome you back to part two. I don't know what happened to our first one, but it got kind of cut off, so I'm redoing this. In the process of redoing this, I added just a couple things. I went ahead and kept our grand total, as you can see down here. And grand total and num items are both what are called local variables. We're declaring them down here in the click event handler for the button, and so they're just called local variables, which means this is really the only place I can use them. And again, we've pulled off the actual name of the product from the list box by taking the first 15 characters off of the item I selected, and then I start at column 35 in my case, and take all the rest of it from that line, and that is the price. Then finally, we just want to keep a running total, and what I've done is I've created the variable called grand total, and using the new .NET way of doing things, we're saying grand total plus equals whatever was in this text box, the price of the item, after we convert it to a single precision number. Now we're using it single precision because we're using money. So my options in Visual Basic are to use a single precision, a double precision, or a decimal data type. And then finally, the thing I added was the num items, which is going to keep track of the number of items they actually bought. I'm just going to take the number of items that they bought and add 1 to it, and this is the new shorthand for that. Num items plus equals 1. So take what was in num items, add 1 to it, and then keep that running total in memory. And then down here, I went ahead and for the label, I put in a little friendly sentence that just says you spent, and then we're going to insert the amount of money they spent, and then down here, you purchased a certain number of items. So again, let me just show you real quick. If they do umbrella and say add to cart, notice down here it says you spent $12.44, thank you, and then you purchased 1 item. Okay. Now our problem is that it's not keeping a running total, see, and it doesn't keep a running a grand total, and it doesn't keep a running count of how many items they purchased. It's always 1, and that's what we want to fix right now. Let me show you how to test this kind of a thing, and this kind of a problem is not necessarily a problem with how you did it. You notice that Visual Studio didn't complain, Visual Basic didn't complain, there was no compiler error, so it doesn't mean that you used the wrong words or you left something out. It just means it's not doing what you intended, and that's called a logical error. And a logical error comes from the fact that you didn't tell it exactly what to do. You obviously thought you did, but the computer is misunderstanding what you wanted, or maybe, as in this case, we did something wrong, we put something in the wrong place, and this is how I want to fix it. Let me show you the best tool for finding these problems that you'll ever use. This is called a debugging tool, and one of the debugging tools is called setting a breakpoint. And I want to show you something. I'm going to go over here into this margin. You see this over here? And I'm going to click once, and it brings up this little red ball, and it highlights this line. You can also do this. You can also put your cursor anywhere where you want to test, put in a breakpoint for you. What I want to do is this. I want to run my program, and I want to stop it right here, and I'm going to have it in suspended animation, and I want to see what the computer thinks the grand total really is. All right, so let's run this, because it happens too fast. You can't figure out what's going on in real time, because it just goes way too fast. So I'm going to pick umbrella. I'm going to say add to cart. Now watch what happens. Visual Basic halts what it's doing, and it comes down here, and this turns yellow. That means it's ready to execute that line. And what you can do is push F8, and what it did was it executed that line. Okay, now everything is just being held in suspension, and I want to show you a real cool trick. If you take the mouse and you just let it sit over where it says grand total, look at that, it says it's $12.44. Cool. Now let's do the number of items and see what happens. The number of items is equal to 1 because they just bought 1. Up here we identified it when we defined it to say 0, but we added 1 to it, so the num items is 1, so that should be 1. We come down here, and what's going to be coming in the label is this message, you spent $12.44 today, thanks. See how that is? So by using the breakpoint, you can just go through your project one line at a time, and you can find out what it's doing wrong. All right, let's push F5 to continue, and let's pick another one. Shirts, add to cart, and let's come over here and try it again. Now, theoretically, this time, if I push F8 again, the grand total should be whatever the first item was plus this one, correct? But you'll notice what it's doing, it's only picking up the very last item. It's not keeping a running total, and it's not keeping a running count. Let's push F8 again. Here's num items. It should be 2. It's 1. All right, now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop this, and I want you to take a look at this code, and I want you to just look at it for a second and see if you can see a reason why we're not getting the effect that we want to, because it looks like it should work. Okay? Now, what I want you to look at is this right here. What happens every time they click the Add button? Let's talk about that. Every miserable time they click the Add button, line 29 executes, and what does it do? Creates a new variable called grand total, and it sets it to 0. Okay? Then line 30 executes. It creates a new variable called num items, and it sets it to 0. Every single time we click on this button, these two variables get set back to 0. So there's absolutely no way that they could ever work as running totals or running counts. You see that? Okay, here's the trick. When you need to keep track of something in memory, and that's all these are doing, and you want to keep track of it over and over again as people are clicking on something, we have to put it somewhere else, and that's the point of this lesson. I'm going to take this, I'm going to do Control X, I'm going to put it right here. Now here's what you need to think about. You put it right after the form definition, and where this says public class and then the name of your form, that's where Visual Basic knows that's the beginning of your form. End class is the end of your form. Okay? You can't put it up here. If you try to put it up here, it's going to complain. It won't work at all. But I've moved it up here, and so it has to be right after where the class starts, and it cannot be in any private sub. See how it is? It's sort of sitting there on its own. Okay, what you've done is you've moved these definitions and these declarations out of the private sub, this click event, and you've moved them up here. And now they're called form level or module level variables. When they're down here, like this, they're called local variables. Okay, make sure you write that down. And what that means is, if you declare things right here inside this click event handler, any event handler, they can only be used in this section of code. That's the only place that Visual Basic sees them, can access them, or do anything with them. Okay? On the other hand, if we put them up here at the form level or module level, now I can use these variables and access them from anywhere within this form. That's the trick to making this work. Okay? So anytime you need to have a variable and you need to access it from this click event and maybe another event handler or maybe the selected index change, whenever you've got to access something from more than one place, or in this case, keep a running total, you have to declare your variables up here. That just lets you use them anywhere inside this form. You can't use them in another form directly, but you can use them. You can use them for this one. Okay, so now let's try it. Now that all I did was move it, and I have a feeling we're going to be fine. I'm going to say add to cart. There's that total. Let's add a shirt, and now you can see it's starting to add up, and it's keeping track of the number of items I bought. So now it's behaving the way I want. Okay, so just by moving that stuff made a huge difference in our application and made it work the way we wanted to. Okay, so just remember that when variables are declared down here in the click event handlers, we say they have local scope. It means their scope of influence or their scope of availability is limited to just this little event handler in here. That's the only place you can use it. When you declare them up here, we say that they have form level scope or module level scope, and that just means you can use them anywhere in that form. All right? Now my advice to you is this. Only put variables up here at the form level when you absolutely need them. Your first best way of programming would be to always declare variables down here in the event handler where you're actually going to use them. The only exception, of course, is for us, that doesn't work because it gets reinitialized every single time they click the button. Okay? So don't forget debug, and don't forget setting breakpoints. You can put a breakpoint anywhere, and you can stop your program and simply run it until it gets to that point, and then you can put your mouse over it and you can actually see what's actually in memory running in that text box or in a variable. It's a very, very, very handy thing to use. Visual Studio has lots of debugging tools. I use that 99.9% of the time. Okay?